Over the past few weeks, I've felt like someone took every plate in the room and threw it into the air all at once. Tariffs have been announced and then challenged, alliances strained and then reassured, and then seemingly strained again. Speeches at Davos, also speeches in Munich, Europe talking about sovereignty, America sounding different depending on who's speaking, and sometimes depending on which day it is. It feels fast, almost too fast to process, if I'm honest. And it raises a question that I can't seem to shake. How do we tell the difference between the speed of headlines and the speed of infrastructure? Because when I zoom out, what I'm starting to see isn't just chaos, it's fracture. As I think back on the speeches that I've watched in the last few weeks, what struck me the most wasn't what any one person said. It was that five American leaders showed up on two global stages recently, sounding like five different countries. At Davos, President Trump framed alliances as transactional, protection in exchange for leverage. In Munich, Marco Rubio framed the alliance as rooted in shared Western identity through history, religion, and ancestry, and argued that strength comes from reclaiming that foundation. Hillary Clinton described the moment as a betrayal of the post war liberal order. Gavin Newsom told Europe to work with California and wait this out. And AOC argued that even the pre Trump system had structural failures that must be corrected. These aren't tonal differences, those are fundamentally different descriptions of who and what America is. And if you're sitting in somewhere like Berlin, Paris, or Brussels, you don't get to choose which America shows up next. So you can't anchor policy to personality. You anchor it to infrastructure. And that's the shift. And I want to be extremely honest here about what it felt like to watch all of these speeches. I didn't feel clarity. I actually felt perplexed, hopeful at some moments, scared in others. There were moments where strength was being celebrated without acknowledging the cost of how that strength was built. Moments where history seemed to be flattened into a civilizational story. And the people erased by that story weren't even part of the conversation. Moments where cooperation sounded conditional, almost transactional. Like the window for partnership seems to be getting narrower or more difficult to define. And I found myself thinking, if the definition of power is shifting in real time, how does the rest of the world plan around that stance? Markets can respond emotionally. Citizens can also respond emotionally, but governments cannot. They have to build around something more stable than tone. So let's make this really simple. Imagine for a second the world as a neighborhood. Every country builds its own swimming pool, or at least that's the atmosphere that's being suggested today. Europe builds a euro pool. America has a dollar pool. Other countries build their own pools. In the past, those pools borrowed infrastructure from one another, whether it be the water, the pipes, the settlement rails. But that reliance is now being questioned with each new news cycle. Inside each pool, water moves extremely fast. That's domestic infrastructure, kind of like SEPA in Europe, the way money moves between banks and countries across Europe. That's FedWire in the United States, the Federal Reserve's high-speed settlement banking system. Inside your own pool, everything works smoothly. It feels like countries are also starting to ask, how do we make sure our pool stays full, regardless of what another country or another pool decides to do? And at the same time, another question seems to be framing on the horizon. And that is, what happens when someone needs to move water from one pool to another? You'll need a pipe, a way to move water. That pipe has to be neutral, meaning jurisdictional shifts or sanctions don't control how money moves. The pipe also has to move water quickly. It has to not belong to just one pool. And it has to work no matter who built the pool itself. That is the interoperability problem. And fractures make the problem bigger, not smaller. Because fracture doesn't eliminate interdependence. Trade still must happen. Even new trade routes are being carved out today. Capital still needs to move. Energy still must flow. Families still need to send money home. Separate pools don't reduce the need for pipes. They increase it. This is where headlines throw a wrench into what I've been noticing. When headlines said Europe was moving away from Visa and MasterCard and building something called Wero, it sounded reactive. It sounded like retaliation. But here's the thing. Wero was launched in 2024, and it's an extension of infrastructure that began being built in the 1990s. It started in Germany and France, and now is live in Germany, France, and Belgium. In its first year alone, it attracted over 50 million registered users and processed tens of billions of euros in transfers. This is not theoretical. This is operational. Wero was built by a coalition of major European banks under the European Payment Initiative. At its launch, it's focused on peer-to-peer transfers. You can kind of think of it like Europe's version of Venmo or Zelle, but running entirely on European rails. When you send money using Wero, it doesn't travel through Visa. It doesn't even travel through MasterCard. It runs on SEPA or SEPA Instant, which is Europe's 24/7 bank-to-bank settlement rail. It operates across 36 countries and in the single euro payments area. The next phase expands into online checkout and eventually in-store payments. None of that began this year. None of that began because of headlines. What changed isn't the build-out. What changed is the relevance. Political instability doesn't create sovereign infrastructure. It makes sovereign infrastructure urgent. And urgency changes timelines. There's another layer most people never see. For decades, banks around the world spoke different languages when they moved money from one bank to another. Each system had its own format for how they sent payment information. It worked, but it was also messy. Then came ISO 20022. It was a shared financial language. By 2025, the global migration was complete. Now, major payment systems in Europe, the United States, and across SWIFT all speak the same structured language. And that matters because if separate pools are going to connect, they need to understand each other. So, this is the world we are moving toward. Not a unified global system, a fractured one that still needs to function. The more sovereign each region becomes, the more structured the connections between them must be. Separate pools don't reduce the need for pipes. They actually increase the need. And that's the world XRP was designed for. Not the pool, but the pipe. It doesn't replace Europe's system. It doesn't replace America's system. It connects sovereign systems without requiring them to merge. That's the design. That's also the benefit. Now here's the part that I want to start with or continue with. The pools are still being defined. Digital euro legislation is not finalized yet. Stablecoin oversight is evolving. Capital treatment rules are still being written. Settlement frameworks are still being debated. We are in the rule writing phase, not the full flow phase, but we are on the field. And something Brad Garlinghouse, the CEO of Ripple, said in a recent interview really stayed with me. He said XRP was built for institutions, period. And that if that's true, then it forced me to rethink my own expectations for XRP. Because institutions don't move on hype cycles. We've been exploring that episode after episode. They don't move on sentiment. They move after regulation, after clarity, after frameworks have been defined. So, if this infrastructure was designed for them, then the timeline was never going to be emotional. It was always going to be institutional. And as we've seen, institutions move after rules, not after pressure, not after emotion. So, when people ask, if this is so obvious, why hasn't the price exploded? The answer is simple. Infrastructure adoption happens after rules are set. But narrative repricing can happen when direction becomes clear. Political chaos might not accelerate infrastructure itself, but it can accelerate recognition of where infrastructure is headed. That's the part that's becoming extremely clear to me. And maybe this is what I didn't understand when I first got into all of this. I thought acceleration would look explosive, like one announcement and everything reprices overnight. But maybe acceleration looks quieter than that. Maybe it looks like nations deciding they don't want to be surprised again. Maybe it looks like building pipes instead of shouting across pools. Maybe it looks like constructing systems that can survive emotional leadership, not just in one particular place, but anywhere in the world. What looks like the world moving too fast may actually be today's headlines revealing yesterday's coordination. Europe does not appear to be reacting emotionally. It appears to be preparing structurally. And if the last few weeks have felt disorienting, you're not alone. If you've watched the headlines and felt like the ground is shifting under something you thought was stable, I want to offer you the thing that has steadied me and continues to steady me. Stop anchoring to personality. Start anchoring to infrastructure. Not because infrastructure is certain, because it isn't, but because we're still in the rule writing phase. Because infrastructure moves on a different clock. Leaders change tones. Narratives swing. Markets react. Infrastructure builds quietly underneath it all. And once you start watching that clock instead of the headline clock, the disorientation does not disappear, but the habit of refreshing the wallet, waiting for something to finally happen, starts to lose its edge. It becomes less reactive and more observant. That's what I've been trying to do here. Not predict, not hype, not react. Just learn to see what's being built underneath all the noise. And to be ready for a world that appears to be arriving. One that needs digital rails, ways to settle value across sovereign systems, quietly, without requiring everyone to agree first. If you'd like to support this channel, there'll be a link in the description. Either way, I'm glad that you're here. This is Layer 1, and this is the conversation. Thank you for joining me for another episode. And until the next one, see you later. Have a great night.